The next area of informal presidential authority is in creating the annual budget for the United States of America. As you may remember from last chapter, the Constitution gives Congress control over all spending, or the power of the purse, but any budget requires the president's signature to become law. So recent presidents have taken the initiative to present their own budget to Congress, leaving Congress to modify his budget to fit their priorities. Traditionally, this has taken the form of looking at what the president submits, looking at last year's budget, and taking away some of his requests for increased funding. However, because the president moves first and establishes the bargaining position, he typically gets most of what he wants. The president's annual budget is typically submitted to Congress on the first Monday in February and takes months of work to put together. He has to assemble and negotiate requests from agencies, bring them into conformity with White House policy goals and his policy goals specifically. And for something as complicated as the budget for the federal government, this can clearly be a Herculean task. But it's the most important document the president submits in any given year, basically establishing the policy direction of the United States for the next year and beyond. For Congress, this budget provides them with valuable technical and political information. It represents the president's opening bid on how much will be spent for what and where the money will come from. The only response recently from Congress in recent years has been to not pass a budget, knowing that, for example, the Paul Ryan budget would never get past Democratic President Obama. But they don't want to pass President Obama's budget because Congress is controlled by Republicans. So instead what they do is pass what's called a continuing resolution, agreeing to fund the government at previously agreed upon levels. The Constitution gives presidents only a modest role in the legislative arena. It gives him the power to call Congress into special session, veto laws in Article 1, and that he must report from time to Congress with the State of the Union address. This makes it clear that legislation is the domain of the legislative branch, giving the president a seemingly small role. And this is exactly what role presidents performed for the first 120 years or so of our nation's existence. However, this was changed when Teddy Roosevelt became the first president to propose legislation, although this was seen as an incredibly presumptuous and as a clear violation of the separation of powers. Much like other expansions of executive power, it quickly became the norm and then devolved into the expectation as we see today. There are two main tools at the president's disposal that help him promote a legislative agenda: the veto and going public. The veto allows the president to block congressional action, but does not allow the president to substitute his own policy preferences. However, the veto does normally require Congress to take into account the president's preferences as legislation is written. Basically what happens is what the economists call a bargaining game. Because Congress knows they won't be able to override a veto, they have to find something that the president will sign. What happens is then we look at the union of policies that Congress provides that are preferable to the status quo, and the ones that the president also finds preferable to the status quo as well. If the two branches can agree on a policy, then we pass a new law. However, if there isn't any policy that both sides prefer, then we maintain the status quo and leave everything the way it is. We'll talk about divided government a little more later, but this is a formal description of why we have such gridlock today. For a brief time, Congress gave the president the ability of what is called the line item veto. This is used at the state level by 43 states, including Virginia, as an instrument of budgetary control, where the executive can strike out any pork barrel spending and anything in legislation that he finds objectionable before signing it. This passed during the Clinton years when a Republican Congress ran on a desire to cut pork barrel spending and cut overall government spending in general. However, this was almost immediately struck down as unconstitutional because the Constitution explicitly describes what the veto is, which means that it can't be modified by a simple act of Congress. It would take a constitutional amendment to be able to do this. The point of all this discussion is that the veto makes Congress take the president's opinion into account when passing legislation, making him the single most powerful legislator in the nation. We talked about going public in class, so I'm not going to burn a lot of calories on it here, but I did want you to think about a couple recent innovations. The first is what we call going local, which is when the president speaks to people in their hometowns rather than going on a national address. George W. Bush back in the day did his 60 stops in 60 days, where he went local and used local media to make his case for him. The Washington press corps may be cynical and less awestruck by the president, but local reporters will almost always write positive stories whenever a president visits, giving him a bump in popularity and hopefully helping approval for his policies in key districts. Another innovation is the use of social media and new media to do these sorts of things. We have President Trump, obviously, who uses Twitter quite a bit to get his message out to his people, unfiltered by what he calls the mainstream media and fake news. But in recent memory, we had President Obama go on Zach Galifianakis' web series Between Two Ferns to promote healthcare.gov. His comedic interview went viral, which is especially important among people under the age of 30, who are in the most need of healthcare and are least likely to pay attention to traditional media. After the appearance, traffic to healthcare.gov went up some ridiculous amount. I don't remember exactly how much, but it was an amazing amount. And the Federal Insurance Exchange saw 1 million new signups in 10 days.